and dear colleagues, respected Dr. Skhuja, in his guest faculty for today's bedside, Dr. Rana. This is with the help of Microlab. We are doing this as a bedside postgraduate program every Monday, and we are very fortunate to have Dr. Skhuja as guest faculty today. And we will all, I'm sure you will all gain a lot with his experience, rich experience and expertise. He is a teacher of teachers. He is a contemporary of Dr. Rana, and he is a teacher for both of me as well as Dr. Ashni Rupta. We have been trained by him, and he is excellent academician and a very good clinician. And I'm sure you will all gain with his expertise. And today's presenter is Dr. Yugesh Anand. He's our final year student who is going to appear for the NBA exams, and I'm sure he will gain a lot from this bedside. Yes, I request Dr. Rana to say a few words, and Dr. Skhuja will start. Dr. Rana, sir.
I just like to thank Vinay for his kindness to be with us today.
Thank you very much for calling me.
इसी बहाने थोड़ा टाइम निकल जाएगा, अच्छा पढ़ाने का आपको मौका मिल रहा है.
बिल्कुल बिल्कुल आपसे मिलने का मौका है.
चलो स्टार्ट करो भी क्लास.
Okay, sir. Good morning, sir. So I'm presenting a case of a 62-year-old female housewife, residents of Uttar Pradesh. Am I audible now? I'm audible, na, sir?
Yes, yes. Yeah.
You're audible.
A little louder.
थोड़ा सा little louder, please.
A little louder. Okay, sir. Yes, sir. So I'm presenting a case of 62-year-old female housewife, resident of Uttar Pradesh. The history was given by herself. She presented to our hospital with chief complaints of cough with expectoration for past 5 days and fever for past 3 days. History of presenting complaint, I would like to date my history back 5 years back when she was first diagnosed with hypertension on evaluation for headache. Her blood pressure at that time was 160 by 90 mm of Hg. The headache was holocranial, was not associated with any aggravating or relieving factor.
थोड़ा slow.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir. Okay, sir. So the headache was holocranial, was not associated with any aggravating or relieving factor. There was no complaint of any fever, difficulty in vision, nausea, vomiting, any limb weakness or abnormal body movement. There was no urinary symptoms at that time. So she does not remember undergoing any blood or urine investigation or any fundus examination. She was started on tablet amlodipine 5 mg once daily. She was under regular follow-up with her physician, and according to her, the blood pressure was under control. Now, 6 months back, she started complaining of fatigability in her daily routine activities, which was gradually progressive. This was associated with dry cough. After around 1 week of these symptoms, she also noticed swelling in her bilateral lower limb, which was confined to her feet, was spitting in nature and without any associated discolorization over the skin. With these complaints, she presented to her physician and underwent investigations which revealed a serum creatinine of around 1.8 mg per day. Blood pressure recorded at that time was normal. At this point of time, she had no complaint of any fever, breathlessness in her routine activities. She does not have any complaint of chest pain nor any urinary complaints such as hematuria, reddish urine or decrease in urine output or frothy urine. She does not remember undergoing any urinary examination at that time. So she was started on some medication, but she is not able to recall the names of those medications. And with these medications, she went home. Over the next 10 to 14 days, she started complaining of nausea and vomiting, which was 1 to 2 episodes per day, decreased appetite. She also started having breathlessness in her daily routine activity, which progressed to breathlessness at rest. She also noticed that her urine output had decreased from 5 to 6 times per day to 2 to 3 times per day, with a total urine output of around 500 to 600 ml per day. Her pedal edema also increased, extending from the feet to the knee joint, and that was splitting in nature, bilateral, symmetrical, and without any associated discolorization of the skin. There was no complaint of any rash, arthralgia, fever, backache, or any nasal or any ear or nose discharge. No complaint of hemoptysis. No complaint of any recent jaundice, recent drug intake. Beside that, prescribed by the physician. There was also no complaint of loose motion, tingling, or numbness sensation in the limbs. There was no complaint of recent weight loss, chest pain, or heaviness. So with these complaints, she was admitted to our hospital. At the time of admission, her blood pressure was normal, and serum creatinine, she remembers, was around 7 to 8 milligram per DL. And she was told that she is leaking blood in her urine. She underwent 3 sessions of hemodialysis, initially through a left femoral access, and then a right IGHD catheter was inserted. After that, she underwent kidney biopsy. The procedure was uneventful. After the biopsy report, she was told that she would require plasmapheresis, and her plasmapheresis and hemodialysis was started on alternate day, each along with, beside this, she was also started on IV and oral medication. So gradually her symptoms started to improve, her breathlessness decreased, urine output improved, pedal edema subsided, and after 7 sessions of plasma exchange and 8 sessions of hemodialysis, she was discharged with a serum creatinine of 2 milligram per day and a urine output of more than 2 liters per day. She remembers taking, at the time of discharge, she remembers taking prednisolone, calcium, Septran, and amlodipine, and she was told that she has to take some injection every 15 days, which I assumed to be cyclophosphamide. She was also asked to measure her blood sugar and blood pressure at home. After 7 injections of cyclophosphamide, she was shifted to Tab-Azoran 100 milligram daily, and at that time her prednisolone was 10 milligram per day. During her follow-up, she remembers her creatinine to be around 1.3 to 1.5 milligram per day, and her urine examination she remembers to be normal. At present, she presented with complaints of cough with expectoration. It is yellowish in color. There is no complaint of any breathlessness, chest pain, or hemoptysis. The fever is of low grade.
Can you keep
without
the
any-
speaker a little closer to your mouth here? Just adjust
Yes.
it so that it is closer.
There is no complaint of any chills, rigor, burning, micturition, loose motion, pain, abdomen. At present, there is no complaint of any decreased urine output, decreased urine output or pedal edema. That is it, sir.
Okay. So after the initial dialysis that she had during the hospital stay, she was no longer dialysis dependent after that.
No, sir. Only during the hospital stay she had dialysis, sir.
Hospital dialysis. And that was, she had about 8 dialysis or so?
8 dialysis and 7 plasma exchange, sir.
7 plasma exchange. Okay. Right. All right. So on the basis of this history, how would you analyze her manifestations? What clinical syndrome are you thinking of in this patient?
So the
Firstly, she
syndrome,
started with hypertension 5 years ago.
yes, sir, which was well
You said.
controlled on a single
And that
medication.
Yeah. So what do you think what was that hypertension due to, you think? Was it related to the present illness or not?
No, sir, I don't think it is related to the present illness, sir. It was maybe, sir, primary hypertension, sir.
Yeah, so I don't think there's any connection between that episode which occurred 5 years back, because
Yes,
there
sir.
was no kidney problem apparently between that episode and recently.
Yes,
There
sir.
was only hypertension. 5 years back, she would have been about 57 years old, right?
Yes, sir.
So the most likely possibility is that this was essential or primary hypertension at that time, and has no relationship to the present illness apparently, and it
Yes,
was
sir.
not a severe hypertension. So I
Yes,
don't
sir.
think there would be any connection with the present problems that she has presented with.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so that
Yes, sir.
finishes with the hypertension. Now she came with a history which started about 6 months back.
Yes, sir.
Now, so this illness which started 6 months back,
Yes, sir.
what would be the clinical syndrome that this illness would best fit into?
Sir,
Now, whenever
rapidly
you see a
progress.
kidney patient, the
Yes,
first
sir.
thing you should do is label the patient with a particular clinical syndrome,
Yes, sir.
right? That's
Yes, sir.
the stepwise analysis that you should do. So which clinical syndrome will this patient fit into?
Sir, she fits into rapidly progressive renal failure, sir.
Okay, right. I agree with that. Why do you think this should be called a RPRF?
Sir, because the progression of a disease was such that it presented in days to weeks, sir. So unlike AKI and unlike chronic kidney disease, it was days to weeks. So RPRF fits in this patient. Sir.
Fine, yeah. In AKI, it usually is hours to days,
Days, yes, sir.
right? So that's a much more rapidly
Acute
oncoming
presentation.
process. Although the word rapid is a part of this term also, RPRF, right? But AKI is even more rapid in its onset and progress than RPRF. So RPRF is between AKI and, as you said correctly, CKD, right?
Yes, sir.
So RPRF is when there is a halving of the GFR or a
Yes, sir.
doubling of the creatinine level
Creatinine.
in less than 3 months. Less than 3 months, right? So
Yes, sir.
that is RPRF. So this patient fits well into a RPRF. And so what underlying cause of RPRF would you think this patient has?
Sir, looking at her presentation, sir, she more likely fits into, sir, RPGN, sir, as a cause of RPRF, sir. And
Why are you thinking of that?
sir, if we look at the causes of RPRF, sir, so it can be divided into vascular causes, then glomerular causes, and tubulointerstitial causes. So, so vascular causes which we know of, sir, is malignant hypertension, thrombotic microangiopathy, sir, and thrombotic microangiopathy and malignant hypertension, sir. In glomerular causes, we have rapidly progressive glomerulonephritis, and in tubulointerstitial causes, we have ATN, ATIN, or myeloma cast nephropathy. So, because she was having she was told that she is leaking blood into urine, sir. So at the presentation and with normal no blood pressure, sir, leaking blood into urine, sir. So I would think more of a RPGN, sir, rather than other possibilities.
Right. Yeah. So that seems to be a reasonable possibility. She presented with some edema. There was hematuria, although microscopic only. So
Yes,
there was no gross hematuria apparently. It could fit with a rapidly progressive glomerulonephritis. Okay,
yes, sir.
fine. I would agree with that part. Now, you mentioned some negative things, negative features in the history of this patient. So when you are thinking of a RPGN as the cause of this patient's kidney disease, can you just go over all the negative things which are important in such
Yes,
a
sir.
patient?
So in RPGN, basically, if we look at the classification of RPGN, it can be of type 1, type 2, type 3. So type 1 is anti-GBM
Yeah, we'll go
disease.
into the classification later. Just tell us
So the important thing is that we have to rule out the other immune complex mediated disease such as lupus. So in lupus, IgA nephropathy, cryoglobulinemia, glomerulonephritis, and so we have to rule out those things. So example, rashes, backache for rule out in myeloma, sir. Any recent jaundice to rule out cryoglobulinemia, sir. Then arthralgia, rashes, jaundice. Then, sir, no previous history of any connective tissue disorder, sir. So that also rules out immune complex mediated disease. No history of any malignant hypertension, sir. That also rules out diseases.
Yes. Can skin rashes be a part of the syndrome causing RPGN also?
Yes, sir. It can be a part,
By
sir.
whatever disease is causing RPGN?
Yes, sir. Yes,
you
sir.
refer to skin rash as part of lupus.
Yes, sir.
But
Yes.
it could also be
And
part of this disease,
yes,
isn't
sir.
it?
Yes, sir.
So what kind of skin rash do you get in these patients?
Sir, purpuric rashes, sir, mostly.
Purpuric. And what is characteristically described as far as this purpura is concerned?
Sir, non-pruritic,
Yes.
non-palpable, non-pruritic purpura, sir.
Non-pruritic but palpable purpura.
Non-pruritic palpable purpura.
Palpebral purpura. In contrast to thrombocytopenic purpuras, which are generally not palpable, this is a palpable purpura because there is inflammation in those skin areas where there is purpura. And if you were to do a skin biopsy, does that help you?
Yes, sir, we can diagnose from the biopsy also, sir, but that does not help me from the renal point of view, sir, because we have to do renal biopsy in order to know the prognosis.
We'll come. But the what kind of histology do you expect on a skin biopsy? Is there a
So
classic
yes,
descriptive?
leukocytoclastic vasculitis, sir.
Yeah, it's a leukocytoclastic vasculitis of the small vessels
Dermal.
in the skin, right? And that is what causes the palpebral purpura. Okay, right. So that's about skin manifestations. You mentioned arthralgias. Arthralgias can also be part of the same
Yes, sir.
illness rather than other illnesses, right? Can there be ocular manifestations?
Yes, sir. In both, sir, in immune complex mediated and in RPGN, because of possible glomerulonephritis, in both of them we can have ocular manifestation. In ANCA vasculitis, we can have ocular manifestation in the form of uveitis, episcleritis. Sometimes a proptosis occur because of the retrobulbar inflammation. Sir.
Yeah. So there can be ocular manifestations which also should be asked for. And the usual manifestation which the patient will tell you about will be simple redness of the eyes. You know, that will be the commonest manifestation. That is how the patient will describe it to you. What you are telling is the interpretation of those findings, what is the lesion behind those findings, right? So you may have ocular involvement. Then can fever be a manifestation?
Yes, sir. Fever can be a manifestation of both
Fever
of these.
can also be a manifestation. What about the upper respiratory tract?
Yes, sir. Upper respiratory tract in the form of sinusitis, sir, or rhinitis, or nasoseptal perforation, saddle nose. So these are more common with patients of Wegener's granulomatosis or PR3 ANCA, and less common in MPO ANCA.
Perforation, saddle nose are very late manifestations. Epistaxis. Epistaxis you should always think of. That's a common manifestation. And see, why I'm emphasizing all these manifestations is because these patients may not necessarily present to the nephrologist, right? Depending on what are their initial manifestations, they may present to a variety of specialists. They can present to a skin specialist, they can present to an eye specialist, or they can present to an ENT surgeon,
ENT specialist,
right, or a rheumatologist, because we know that the spectrum of clinical manifestations is very wide, right? So not all patients will come to the internist or the nephrologist. That is what, so that is something that all non-nephrologists in particular need to remember. You are aware of this condition, so you're not likely to miss it. You're likely to think of it. But those who belong to these other specialities, they may not be so much aware of this entity, and they are more likely to miss it, particularly the first time the patient comes. So it's very important for them to be aware. Then in the upper respiratory tract, sometimes even the ears can be involved. Even ear discharge and deafness can be manifestations of this condition. The peripheral nervous system can be involved. It's not very common, but you can get a mononeuritis multiplex in some of these patients. And then the lower respiratory tract. And how does that manifest?
So lower respiratory tract can manifest in the form of alveolar hemorrhage, sir, or it can manifest in the form of nodular or nodular lesion or with cavitation, sir.
Yeah. So
or in case of
alveolar hemorrhage, what will the patient complain of?
So patient may be asymptomatic. Either the patient can have dry cough or maybe asymptomatic, sir, or may present with anemia.
Yes.
Or so they may, in the late presentation, they may present with fibrosis, sir. So
no, even before that,
Hemoptysis, sir?
Yeah, they can have hemoptysis. Why are you
Yes.
ignoring that? They can have overt hemoptysis as the first manifestation of an alveolar hemorrhage. So the hemorrhage is not always hidden to be looked for only on an X-ray. It can be overt hemoptysis. So that's very important. And the other thing that they will present with when there is, if there is diffuse alveolar hemorrhage, they will have shortness of breath and they'll go into hypoxia, right? And if the alveolar hemorrhage is severe, it can even give rise to acute respiratory failure requiring ventilatory support.
Yes, sir.
So all these manifestations you need to ask for, right? Hemoptysis, don't ignore hemoptysis, very important. So those are the things that you should, which should be emphasized when you're talking about the negative features of the history. In this patient, you apparently didn't have any of those manifestations that we have just talked about,
Yes, sir.
right?
Yes, sir.
The only, the one or two things that you did not tell us in the story of this patient's hospital stay. One was, did the chest X-ray show any findings?
Sir, I did ask her. She said that there was some abnormality, but neither does she remember, sir, what was the finding in chest X-ray, or because, sir, she has not brought the report. But when I asked her, was there any problem in chest, she did mention this. Yes, there was some problem in chest, but she cannot specify, sir, what exactly that was.
So we don't know the details of that. That
Yes,
is
sir.
not available to us.
No, sir.
And no chest CT was done at that time.
Yes, the chest CT was done. She
Was
remembers
done.
that. Yes, sir. The chest
Okay.
CT was done, sir.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. So anyway, those were two important things that are worth looking into. If in case we are able to get those investigations, then it would be worthwhile to have a look at them later on. You can see if they are still traceable. And what about you told us about the management, but what was the ANCA status?
Yes, sir.
Do
She
we
was
know that?
Yes, sir. She was C-ANCA positive and PR3 positive, sir.
So she was PR3 positive.
Yes, sir.
PR3. Okay, right. Right, right. So that's an important, very important finding that will have relevance when we come to the management of this patient, but that will be a little later. Right. And so this patient received treatment most likely with pulse cyclophosphamide.
Yes, sir.
She got pulse steroids as well.
Sir, she does not exactly remember steroid, but she says that she was prescribed some IV medication during hospitalization, but she cannot specify that whether it was methylprednisolone.
But she got oral steroids after that.
Yes, at the time of discharge. Yes, sir.
Yes, and she got plasmapheresis and hemodialysis, of course, that
yes, sir.
told us. Right. Okay, and at the time of discharge, the creatinine had come down to around 1.8 or so.
2 milligram per DL, sir.
2 milligram.
At the time of discharge.
2 milligrams, right. So that's where we are right now. Now, presently, you said that the patient has presented with cough with some sputum of 5 days duration and fever of 3 days duration.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So what is your analysis of this history? What do you think is this due to?
Sir, it can be both due to one infection, sir. Second, or the relapse of the disease itself, sir. So we have to rule out both.
Yes, I would fully agree with that. These are the two possibilities that you have to think of. Since this patient had ANCA positive vasculitis, so it could be a relapse. That's certainly one possibility. And fever and cough and some sputum could all be manifestations of that relapse. But the second possibility, which is also very likely, is that since this patient is immunosuppressed, she could have developed a superimposed infection, and that could be viral or bacterial, and that could be the
Fungal.
cause of this fever and cough which she is currently having. This time the urine analysis is
Yes, sir. Urine
normal.
analysis this time, yes, sir. It's normal, sir. And the serum creatinine is 1.6 milligram per day, sir.
1.6, and urine analysis is normal. So
Normal.
that report suggests that probably there is at least no renal relapse,
Yes, sir.
because you have no microhematuria and the creatinine is not higher than before,
Yes, sir.
lower than before, 1.6. So that's not surprising. She might have been left with a little residual damage.
Yes,
So
sir.
having a creatinine of 1.6 is not at all surprising at this stage. And urine is free of hematuria. So that these features tend to suggest that there is no renal relapse.
Yes, sir.
If at all there is a relapse, there may be an extrarenal relapse, which you have to look for. Have you already had a chest X-ray done?
No, sir. These were the only investigation
Not
we
yet.
have.
Not
Sir.
yet. Okay. Okay. So those investigations you could do to look for evidence of a relapse. So this would be the differential diagnosis of the present problem. Two things: infection versus a relapse of the vasculitis. Now, when you are faced with such a patient, you see such a patient either in the OPD or after admission in the ward, what are all the investigations that you would order?
Yes, sir. So first of all, I would like to do CBC, complete blood count. Then,
Yes.
sir, ESR, CRP. Then, sir, renal function test in the form of serum creatinine, blood urea nitrogen, sodium, potassium, calcium, phosphorus. Sir, I would also like to do. I would also like to look for total protein, serum albumin, sir.
Right.
And sir, urine analysis I have done before, sir. So I'm not. I would like to do urine analysis also, sir. And then, sir, I would like to do an imaging. In the imaging study, I would like to do an ultrasonography and chest X-ray. Then, sir, in serological test, I would like to do complements level, ANCA, ANA. And looking at her age, sir, I would also like to rule out any underlying monoclonal disorders, sir. So at least, sir, protein electrophoresis also I would like to do, sir.
Okay. Okay. Dr. Sunil Prakash wants to know, was anti-streptolysin O titer done? ASO titer?
No, sir, not done.
It was not done. Okay. So do you think it would be worthwhile to do that also?
Sir, at that time she had no hypertension. So generally, sir, PSGN generally presents with acute nephritic syndrome of hypertension, edema, and obviously hematuria and oliguria, sir. So just because there was no hypertension, there was no history of any sore throat. So, sir, it's unlikely to be a PIGN rather than in favor of ANCA, sir.
Yes, relatively unlikely, but you can't totally rule it out. So an ASO titer is also certainly worthwhile to do as part of the workup. And I think you didn't mention viral markers in the workup.
Yes, sir. Viral markers, sir. It's important,
Yeah,
sir.
you should look for viral
Yes, sir.
markers like hepatitis C,
Hepatitis C,
hepatitis
B.
B.
HIV.
Rarely even HIV can be associated with this kind of illness. So viral markers should be done in all patients. You mentioned a chest X-ray. In all patients who have diffuse alveolar hemorrhage, it's or any other pulmonary lesions, not only DAH, or any other pulmonary lesions, it's always worthwhile to do an HRCT of the chest, because that is much more sensitive for picking up pulmonary involvement.
Yes, sir.
There may be subtle pulmonary involvement, which may be missed on a routine chest X-ray. And for picking up the extent of the disease, that's a very useful investigation. So in those who do have pulmonary involvement or have a suspicion based on their hypoxia, I would certainly do an HRCT of the chest as well, right? So that's one more investigation that I would like to do. What about, you
Anyway,
mentioned micro...
Dr. Pooja,
Yes, Dr. Rana.
I think HRCT thorax should be almost a routine investigation in this case. Matlab, you know, in a
Yes, yes. Yes,
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 sir.
I fully agree.
nowadays X-ray test to just say almost not a
X-ray test is a very basic investigation.
very basic, or HRCT thorax, wherever you suspect vasculitis or
Yes, sir.
something like
Yes,
fever, this is something very basic investigation you should do
I
immediately. Otherwise,
fully
you will
agree.
be planning diagnosis for quite some time.
Yes, yes, I fully agree with that. I fully agree with that. Yeah. So, Dr. Yogesh, you also mentioned measuring complement levels. Now, what's the value of that?
So it helps us to differentiate. So it has two values. One, it helps to differentiate whether it is an immune complex mediated disease or it's a post-immune disease. And second, it also nowadays it has been reported that the hypocomplementemia, if associated with post-immune glomerulonephritis, has a poor prognosis, sir. Although it's not common to have hypocomplementemia in post-immune, but
Yeah. So,
the
in
main motive
most
is to differentiate.
yeah, in most patients with the post-immune disease, the complement levels will be normal.
Normal.
The serum
Yes, sir.
complement levels will be normal. So if you have hypocomplementemia, it goes more in favor of conditions like
Conditions like PIG, post-infectious glomerulonephritis,
yes,
lupus,
lupus,
infection-related glomerulonephritis, sir. Then
yeah,
shunt nephritis, endocarditis, sir, or C3 glomerulonephritis, dense deposit disease.
yeah. So it would go more with those conditions rather than a post-immune disease. Obviously, we'll come to the role of complement in the pathogenesis, but hypocomplementemia is not a usual
Impossible.
feature of post-immune disease. So if you have hypocomplementemia, first think of something else.
Yes, yes, sir.
Don't think of post-immune disease first, right? That's important. So that will be roughly the list of investigations that I would order. What about, yes, I think you mentioned looking for ANA. That is fine because lupus can also be a cause of an RPGN. That's fine. But when you have a combination of hemoptysis and renal involvement, any other investigation that you should look for?
Anti-GBM levels, sir.
Yes, you didn't mention that. Isn't that important?
Anti-GBM level.
That's something very, very important. Although, yes, Dr. Rana.
Yeah, I just want to tell them, once you think of glomerular, then you have to think of immune complex as well as anti-GBM disease both, you know, because so that, you know, don't forget, start from glomerular. Similarly, you have not mentioned about drug history also. Drug history also, somebody can, though of course in this case you are knowing that patient has plasmapheresis receptor, so you know the diagnosis now. But let us say you were not knowing, you should always ask that drug history also. Like you mentioned, one of the causes
Yes.
AIN.
Mention, sir, in history, sir.
Acute nephritis. You should take very clearly history of drugs. You know, they can also produce hematuria and a very severe syndrome of AIN actually, and can mimic this sort of thing. You know, so all those things should be asked. I think. And anyway, I don't want to tell you, Professor Skujay taking so.
No, you're absolutely right. The drug history is also important. For another reason also, one that drugs could cause acute interstitial nephritis, which could be a differential diagnosis of RPGN. Besides that, I hadn't talked about pathogenesis, so I didn't talk about drugs as yet. But drugs, since you have mentioned it, can also be a cause of post-immune disease.
Yes, sir.
Right, and the drugs which are commonly blamed for this are
antithyroid medication,
propylthiouracil, and minocycline. These are the commonest drugs that have been associated with post-immune disease. So since the point has been raised, so otherwise I was going to take it up later, but so the drug history also is certainly important, right? So these are the three drugs which have commonly been associated. And one other thing that has been described with drug-induced ANCA-associated vasculitis that is very unusual is that both PR3 and MPO ANCA can be positive in this situation. Otherwise, you do not get both of them positive in any other situation. In drug-induced ANCA, for some unknown reason, you get positivity with both PR3 and MPO,
MPO.
right? So that is one feature of drug-induced pauci-immune disease that you should remember. Okay. Now, while we are here, could you also tell us about the classification of vasculitis?
So the classification of vasculitis was given by Chapel Hill Consensus Conference, which has been revised in 2012. It divides vasculitis into following categories: so large vessel vasculitis, medium vessel vasculitis, small vessel vasculitis, variable vessel vasculitis, and vasculitis involving a single organ. So this now, sir, large vessel vasculitis include giant cell arteritis and Takayasu's arteritis. Medium vessel vasculitis include polyarteritis nodosa, Kawasaki disease. Small vessel vasculitis can be divided into two parts, whether it is immune complex mediated or pauci-immune. So in pauci-immune, we have granulomatosis with polyangiitis, microscopic polyangiitis, and
A little slower,
eosinophilic.
slower, and a little louder.
And sir, eosinophilic granulomatosis with polyangiitis. So these are the
Yes.
pauci-immune, and there can be renal limited vasculitis also. And sir, in coming on to the immune complex mediated, there are four types: anti-GBM, IgA vasculitis, anti-C1q vasculitis, and cryoglobulinic vasculitis. Variable vessel vasculitis include BH syndrome and Cogan syndrome. And vasculitis confined to a single organ may be isolated CNS vasculitis, sir.
Yes, it could be isolated CNS or skin or aortic vasculitis. Those are rare varieties. And there is also a group of which is called probable etiology vasculitis, where the etiology is not established beyond doubt. And that includes malignancies and viral etiologies like hepatitis B and hepatitis C, right? And sometimes drugs as well. So that is so-called probable etiology vasculitis. And then, yeah, there's another category. These additional categories were not there in the Chapel Hill classification. They were added in a classification suggested by Charles Jennett after the Chapel Hill classification. And yet another group is systemic diseases, which will include lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, and sarcoidosis, right? So in addition to the groups that you have mentioned, you can add these entities. So that will more or less complete the list. And I would just like to repeat for the benefit of the others that in the small vessel vasculitis, you have an ANCA positive group and now you have a immune complex group. In the ANCA positive group, you mentioned all these, but I'm just repeating for the benefit of everyone else so that nobody has missed it. So there are 4 categories of small vessel vasculitis in the ANCA positive group. So there is granulomatosis with polyangiitis, which was earlier called Wegener's granulomatosis, right? There is eosinophilic granulomatosis with polyangiitis, which was earlier called Churg-Strauss syndrome. I'm sure you're familiar with these names. Then there is microscopic polyangiitis, which is again a systemic disease, so involving the kidneys as well as extrarenal sites. And finally, there is vasculitis, small vessel vasculitis limited to the kidney. So that's a renal limited vasculitis. Okay, so 4 categories in the ANCA positive group. So I hope that is clear to everybody. And one thing which separates these into 2 groups, these 4 entities, is the presence of granulomatous histology. The term granulomatosis is there as part of granulomatosis with polyangiitis of Wegener and eosinophilic granulomatosis, right? So granulomas are a feature of the histology of these two varieties, whereas in microscopic polyangiitis and renal limited vasculitis, granulomas are not a feature of the disease, right? Is that clear? Okay. So we've gone over the classification of vasculitis. Now, have you heard of the term pulmonary renal syndrome or renopulmonary syndrome?
Yes, sir.
Yes, what is
Pulmonary
that?
renal syndrome, pulmonary renal syndromes implies that there is involvement of both kidney and lung. Now, there are
Yes.
various subtypes of pulmonary renal syndrome, sir. Pulmonary renal syndrome is one category. Then comes, sir, a Goodpasser syndrome, which is RPGN along with alveolar hemorrhage. Then there is anti-GBM disease, in which we have antibodies to GBM, not specifically against the Goodpasser antigen. Then we have a Goodpasser disease, in which we have specifically against the antigen of Goodpasser syndrome, sir.
Mm. So pulmonary renal syndrome, now there are two ways in which, two situations in which the term can be used, which are totally different from each other. One is you restricting the use of the term to patients who have alveolar hemorrhage and a necrotizing or crescentic GN, a combination of those two, right? Earlier, there was a group who used to limit this term to only such patients. And so that would include like patients with anti-GBM disease or ANCA-associated vasculitis. However, there are others who will apply the label of pulmonary renal syndrome to patients who have any renal disease with any pulmonary complication. So in other words, even a nephrotic syndrome with pulmonary thromboembolism
Yes, sir.
or a nephrotic syndrome
Acute.
with a pneumonia as a complication, right? These would all qualify for being called a pulmonary renal syndrome. So you need to be clear about which particular definition you are following when you describe the term pulmonary renal syndrome. So, so this is no longer a term that is restricted only to patients with alveolar hemorrhage and a crescentic GN. All right. There is a wider connotation to the pulmonary renal syndrome, just as you have in the cardiorenal syndrome, right?
Yes,
The cardiorenal syndrome is a combination of so many
5
things.
types. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so many types. So similarly, the pulmonary renal syndrome can also be a combination of so many different kinds of renal lesions and different kinds of pulmonary lesions, right? So that's about pulmonary renal syndrome. But when it was originally described, yes, it was restricted to a particular entity only, particular clinical syndrome. Yes, you also, earlier in your presentation, you were talking about types of rapidly progressive glomerulonephritis. Can you just go over that classification also for the benefit of
So,
everybody?
So it's of 3 types, type 1, type 2, type 3. Type 1 is anti-GBM disease. Type 2 is immune complex mediated disease. And type 3 is post-immune glomerulonephritis.
The one which is associated with ANCA positivity.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Okay, so these are the 3 main types of rapidly progressive glomerulonephritis that we classify them into. And this classification is actually largely based on the presence or absence of the ANCA antibodies, and immunofluorescence plays a very major role in applying this diagnostic label, isn't it? This is an
Yes,
immunofluorescence based classification. Because for instance, the immune complex group will be identified not necessarily by a serological marker, but by the presence of immune complexes
Immunoglobulin.
on the
Biopsy.
histology, on the biopsy, right? And similarly, the anti-GBM group can also be confirmed by immunofluorescence. So it's the
Yes, sir.
immunofluorescence which is of cardinal importance in classifying patients according to this classification. Now, let's come to another aspect. When you use the term RPGN, what kind of kidney histology do you expect in such a patient typically? Or
So
classically?
typically, such patient would have crescentic glomerulonephritis, sir.
Okay, when you say crescentic glomerulonephritis, what percentage of the glomeruli should show
More than
crescent?
more than 50%, sir.
More than 50%, yeah. So that's important to remember. Then you call it a crescentic glomerulonephritis.
Yes, sir.
The next question is, do all patients with RPGN have a crescentic GN?
No, sir. It's not necessary that all patients of RPGN will have crescentic GN, sir. I mean, it's not necessary that more than 50% of glomeruli with crescent has to be involved in order to cause RPGN, sir. Although in majority of our patients we will find this finding, sir.
Yeah, that will be in the majority, yes. The classical presentation, classical finding on histology will be crescentic, but not all patients.
Yes,
So
sir.
can you have a clinical picture of RPGN, but with no crescents at all?
Yes, with no crescents at all, sir. Sir, yes, sir. If there is an intense tubulointerstitial inflammation, sir,
No,
with
but there has to be glomerular disease, isn't it?
You are saying glomerulonephritis, so
You're talking about
yes, sir.
glomerulonephritis, not tubulointerstitial disease.
so don't go to you say what can happen then?
No, I don't know, sir.
Apart from
Thrombo,
this, what can happen to vessels?
sir, thrombosis of vessels or rupture of the capillary wall, sir.
No, what about in post-streptococcal, typical post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis? What is the
Yes, sir.
histological finding?
Sir, it's diffuse proliferative glomerulonephritis, sir.
Yes. And do they have crescents?
Sir, in less than 5% of the patient they have crescents.
Yeah. So they most of the time they don't have crescents, isn't it? In the typical case of PSGN, PIGN, right? They have an acute, diffuse, endocapillary, proliferative, exudative glomerulonephritis. They may have no crescents at all. And with that histology also, you may have a clinical picture of RPGN. All right. So remember this. And the same thing can happen in a patient with lupus nephritis.
Yes, sir.
You can have class 4 lupus nephritis without crescents, but with a clinical picture of RPGN. Clinical picture of RPGN simply means a declining GFR, a rising serum creatinine, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
So remember this, that you can have a clinical picture of RPGN without any crescents or with less than 50% of glomeruli showing crescents. Right? Is that clear?
Yes,
And
sir.
now the asking you the question the other way around. Do all patients with crescentic GN have RPGN?
No, sir. Again, depends upon the amount of crescent they have, sir. It's not necessary that all will present with RPGN, sir.
Yes. So that's another important thing to remember. There are a small number of patients of crescentic GN. In other words, they have more than 50% glomeruli affected by crescents. That's why you're calling them crescentic. But they may not necessarily behave clinically as RPGN. They may have a milder course, and in rare instances, they may even have nephrotic range proteinuria. There have been
Yes, sir.
even patients described like that. So there are exceptions both ways. Not all crescentic GN is rapidly progressive, and not all RPGN is associated with crescents. That's the point that I wanted to make. Okay. Now let's come to testing for ANCA.
Yes, sir.
Yes. So how do you test for ANCA?
So there are two methods of testing for ANCA. One is the immunofluorescence and second is ELISA. So in
Okay,
immunofluorescence,
what is, yeah, this was the earlier way of testing, that you test both by indirect immunofluorescence and by ELISA, you do the antigen specific assays and get a titer also.
yes, sir.
But what is the current recommendation?
Sir, what is new beside this immunofluorescence and ELISA, sir? Sir,
Yes.
besides, there is mass spectrometry also coming into play, sir, in order to specify a specific epitope against which the antibody is directed, sir.
See, what is now recommended, what you were talking of was the 1999 consensus by Savage et al. And that is what has been followed for a long time. It's only recently that high quality antigen specific immunoassays have become available. So there are capture based assays, anchor based assays that are now available. There's a review article on this by Bossuet et al. In 2017, which I would suggest that all of you should read. And the new consensus now suggests that indirect immunofluorescence should be given up. These assays should be used, and as a result of the use of these assays, because you're giving up indirect immunofluorescence, so the important other conclusion is, other thing to remember is that the term C-ANCA and P-ANCA are now obsolete. All right. And you should stick to only PR3 positive,
or MPO,
which corresponded to the C-ANCA earlier, or MPO ANCA or myeloperoxidase ANCA, which corresponded to the P-ANCA earlier. So the term P-ANCA and C-ANCA should no longer be used. In fact, even when you're sending a request to the lab for an ANCA test, ask for PR3 ANCA and MPO ANCA. PR3 stands for proteinase
3,
and MPO for
myeloperoxidase.
Right? So that is what you should ask for. And indirect immunofluorescence should only rarely be required if the antigen specific assay turns out to be negative, which can rarely happen. And if you have a very high index of suspicion, in that situation, you may consider doing a IIF. Okay. So otherwise, indirect immunofluorescence should be given up. How often are ANCAs negative even in the setting of post-immune disease?
10%, sir. It's in almost 10% of the patient it's negative.
With these specific assays, it has gone down a bit. So something like 5 to 10% would be the figure. And what immunoglobulin class do these antibodies belong to?
IgG, sir.
IgG, yes. So they are IgG antibodies that you are looking for. Okay. And while I'm on this point, it is now also being emphasized that when you apply a diagnostic label to a given patient, right? For instance, we'll come to this patient. So you should not just talk of the clinico-pathological phenotype, right? Like you say, granulomatosis with polyangiitis. That's the clinico-pathological phenotype. But you should also add to that the ANCA serotype. The diagnosis is incomplete without that.
Hello. Yes, sir.
Yes, you had disappeared momentarily. Yes, so the complete diagnosis, for instance, in this patient, this would be a PR3 ANCA positive small vessel vasculitis. So probably granulomatosis with polyangiitis, right? I don't have the details of the kidney biopsy report. We'll come to that discussion also in a short while. So mentioning the ANCA subtype or serotype along with the clinical diagnosis is now gaining a lot of importance. And I'll come to why that is so a little while later when we discuss the management and so on. Okay. Now, in this kind of patient, when this patient presented, a kidney biopsy was done and an ANCA also was done, which you mentioned was PR3 positive. So in such a patient, if you have an ANCA positive, isn't that enough? Why do you have to do a kidney biopsy?
Sir, in order to prognosticate and decide treatment, sir, we have to do a kidney biopsy to look at the level of inflammation, fibrosis. So we have to do biopsy, sir.
Okay, so you're talking of prognostication from the biopsy.
Yes,
That's
yes,
one utility
and
of doing a
treatment
biopsy.
also,
But
sir.
is there anything else? Any other reason why you are insisting
Sir,
on a
in
biopsy?
order to differentiate also whether it is immune complex mediated or it's post-immune, also we can differentiate whether it is anti-GBM. So etiologically also we can to some extent differentiate with biopsy, sir.
Yeah, but see, lupus you can differentiate on the basis of ANA. You really don't need to do a biopsy for that
Sir, to
purpose.
decide treatment also, sir.
To decide treatment.
Yes, sir.
You mean whether it's too late for treatment or it's still
Yes, sir.
treatable? You mean that?
Yes,
So
sir.
that's
Yes,
again
sir.
prognostication.
And
See, there is false positivity of ANCA also. So one reason for doing a biopsy is false positivity of ANCA in certain situations. Secondly, MPO ANCA, or what was called P-ANCA earlier, can be positive in a variety of situations other than post-immune vasculitis, which include lupus, endocarditis, primary
inflammatory bowel
sclerosing
disease.
cholangitis, cystic fibrosis, and so
Inflammatory
on,
bowel disease, sir.
isn't it?
Yes,
So there are
yes, sir.
other diseases also, inflammatory bowel disease also, ulcerative colitis. So there can be positivity of ANCA in diseases other than post-immune vasculitis. One, then there can be false positivity of ANCA in diseases like myeloma and hypergammaglobulinemia. Okay. And finally, as you said, for prognostication. So these are the reasons why a kidney biopsy is considered important. And there are only rare situations where you may proceed to treatment on the basis of an ANCA positivity without doing a kidney biopsy. And that is supposing you have a patient who's in respiratory failure. You can't do a biopsy in that situation. Or if there is a bleeding diathesis for some reason, right? Or you have a single kidney. So there may be rare situations where you are unable to do a biopsy, but in the vast majority of situations, you should do a biopsy before you launch on therapy. Okay, so that's the important thing about doing a biopsy. Then there's one other point about an ANCA positivity here. Does ANCA positivity rule out anti-GBM disease?
No, sir. Sir, because in 10 to 30, in 5 to 15% of a patient with ANCA, anti-GBM can be present, and in 10 to 30% of the patient with anti-GBM, ANCA can be present, sir. So dual
Yes.
positivity is a possibility.
That dual positivity, that's, as you said, that's correct. That's correct. So that's another reason. That's another reason why you want a biopsy,
Yes, sir.
right? You could have a patient with dual positivity, and then you are not sure, are you dealing with ANCA-associated disease? Is that the predominant disease, or is this anti-GBM antibody-mediated disease? And what will decide the issue will be the kidney biopsy. If you get a posse-immune kidney biopsy, then it would suggest this is ANCA-associated disease. Whereas, what would you expect in anti-GBM antibody disease?
Sir, linear IgG staining along with complements also, sir.
Yeah, linear IgG and C3 along the capillary walls
Walls.
would
And-
suggest anti-GBM antibody-mediated disease, right?
Yes,
So
sir.
the biopsy would then decide. So that is yet another reason why you need a biopsy. Just ANCA positivity is not an absolute confirmation of the diagnosis of what is happening in the kidney, right? Okay. You talked about prognostication on the basis of biopsy, right? So how do you prognosticate? What is the classification on the basis of which this prognostication is done?
Sir, on biopsy or overall, sir?
On biopsy. I'm talking of the biopsy, the kidney
So,
biopsy.
sir, in kidney biopsy, sir, there are four classes of, there are four categories, sir. One is focal, one is crescentic, one is sclerotic, and one is mixed category, sir. So the best
Good, yes,
prognosis,
yes.
the best prognosis is with focal category, sir, and the
Right.
worst prognosis is with sclerotic category.
Yes.
And sir, between crescentic and mixed, so it follows like focal, crescentic, mixed, and then sclerotic category. So on the basis
Yeah,
of that,
agreed. So crescentic and mixed are in between the focal, which is the best, and sclerotic, which is the worst, as you said, right? And whose classification is this, if you remember that?
sir, burden
Burden.
classification. Burden classification.
Burden in 2010 suggested that classification. So when would you call it a focal disease?
Focal disease, sir, if more than 50% of the glomeruli are normal, sir.
Normal, good, yes. More than 50% normal.
And
If more than
sclerotic,
50% sclerotic, then it becomes sclerotic. If more than 50% show cellular crescents, then it is crescentic.
and mixed.
And if less than 50% are normal, less than 50% showing crescents, and less than 50% showing sclerosis, then it becomes the mixed variety. Okay, so that is the classification that is used for prognostication. Of course, in addition to that, you should also look at the degree of interstitial fibrosis and tubular atrophy that you see in the histology. That would also be an indicator of the prognosis, because it would mean the more IF and TA that you have, the more chronicity there is going to be, right? What about mentioning the percentage of glomeruli showing crescents? How important is that? How reliable is that?
Sir, percentage of glomeruli seeing crescent, sir, it will decide. Sir, more than 50% of the glomeruli, it's crescentic, sir. Less than 50%, it's not crescentic glomerulonephritis.
Fine.
And sir, in particularly in case of GBM, sir, anti-GBM disease, if there is 100% crescent, sir, then the prognosis is not good, sir, in biopsy.
Yeah, if you have 100% crescents and most of them are circumferential.
Circumferential crescent, yes, sir.
Yeah, then that certainly influences the prognosis. But when the pathologist tells you, say 70% of the glomeruli are showing crescents, how reliable is that figure?
Sir, because
can he be absolutely sure of that figure?
No, sir, because it's not. So it is just a sample, sir. Does not mean that it's entirely diffusely. It's like that.
Can the pathologist see glomeruli in which he sees no crescents, and yet there may be a crescent in some of those glomeruli?
In which there is no, I don't know, sir. Depends gut section, sir. Depending upon the
Yeah,
gut sections.
this can happen, you see, because a glomerulus is a globe, is a spherical structure,
Yes, sir.
right? A ball-like structure. The crescent may be only situated on part of the glomerulus, okay? If it's not circumferential
Mm.
and the section does not go through, pass through the crescent, the section passes through the rest of the glomerulus, the crescent will not be seen.
Yes, sir.
Agreed?
Yes, sir.
So the crescent score that the pathologist gives you is actually, and to some extent, an underestimate of the true percentage. It's only if he has done multiple serial sectioning that the report is likely to be more reliable, right? So the
Yes.
crescent scores can be an underestimate. And secondly, the crescent scores can change from time to time also. Like there can be a new wave of crescent formation,
Relapse. Yes, sir.
right? So there may be 40% crescents at one stage. At a later stage, there may be 70% crescents, right? On the basis of a biopsy, on light microscopy, can you distinguish anti-GBM disease from ANCA-associated disease?
Yes, sir. So in anti-GBM disease 1, there is more glomerular involvement compared to ANCA. And the crescent which we see are of same age in anti-GBM, whereas they are of different ages in ANCA vasculitis, sir.
Yes, yes. So that is one point which has been emphasized, that in anti-GBM disease, all the lesions that you see are of the same age. So they've all developed simultaneously together at the same point in time. Whereas that may not necessarily apply to ANCA-related disease. But is light microscopy enough to, is it reliable enough to differentiate between anti-GBM and ANCA-associated disease?
No, sir. Immunofluorescence is the definitive test, sir.
Yes, you should always do immunofluorescence. Otherwise, you can go wrong in the diagnosis. So never base your diagnosis only on light microscope. So that's an important thing, because maybe there may be some centers who are not doing immunofluorescence in their own histology lab, and making a diagnosis based only on light microscopy, you can go wrong. So don't ever try to do that, right? Okay. Yes, before we go on to the management, now what are the crescents that you see on histology? What cells constitute that crescent?
Sir, parietal epithelial cells, macrophages, and fibrin cell. It's basically made up of these three components, sir.
Yeah. So yes, you're right. It's the parietal epithelial cells and macrophages or monocytes which move into that area, which
Yes,
are not
sir.
a normal component. There are gaps in the Bowman's capsule
Yes, sir.
and the capillary basement membrane of the glomerular capillaries, through which the fibrin also leaks out, and these monocytes or macrophages can also move in. And it is said that in an early crescent, it's mainly the parietal epithelial cells. In a later crescent, there are more macrophages, which constitute the cellular component of the crescent. And finally, there are also fibroblasts. There may be a small role played by T cells and neutrophils also, but mainly epithelial cells, macrophages, and later fibroblasts, right? So these are the cells which constitute the crescent. And normally, how many layers of cells are there in the crescent?
Sir, more than 2 layers, sir.
Yeah, there should be at least 2 layers
At least
of
2 layers.
cells before you can call it, because the parietal epithelium itself is a single layer. So you must have at least 2 layers of cells before you call it a crescent. Right? Okay. So now let's go on to the management so that we are able to finish in time. So how do you, if you have a proven case of ANCA-associated vasculitis as you had here, because this patient was PR3 positive. So the first step is induction therapy. And at a later stage, you go on to maintenance therapy. Those are the two parts of therapy. So how do you induce remission?
So the induction component has two parts, sir. One is steroid and one is immunosuppressant agent in the form of cyclophosphamide or rituximab. So,
Okay, right. So how would you give steroids?
so steroid is given as 500 to 1000 milligram per day for 3 days, then 1 milligram per kilogram of the body weight for at least 2 to 4 weeks, and then it is tapered, sir. And by the end of 6 months, either we have option of continuing 5 to 10 milligram per day, or we can discontinue also, so depending upon the patient's profile.
Okay, so that's as far as steroids are concerned. The standard, this is the standard regimen that has been used for a very long time. Okay, and what would be the other induction agent that you would use? You would choose from?
Sir, cyclophosphamide or rituximab. Now we have to decide which of them to choose, sir. In severe life-threatening damage, sir, we have to prefer. We generally should prefer cyclophosphamide. In children and adolescents and premenopause,
In life-threatening?
like organ-threatening or life-threatening diseases, cyclophosphamide is preferred over rituximab.
Is preferred.
Yes, sir.
Is there any evidence to suggest that that should be the way it is?
Sir, because a head-on-head comparison of rituximab and cyclophosphamide was done in 2 trials, a RAVE and rituxivas trial. In RAVE
Yes.
trial, the patient which was selected had a creatinine of less than 4 milligram per DL. But in rituxivas trial, more severe, dialysis-dependent patients were considered, sir. Even dialysis-dependent patients were considered. It's more severe immune involvement patients were considered. And sir, although sir, both were equally effective, sir, in that. But
Yeah,
sir, it's
so they were
recommended,
not,
sir.
they said that rituximab is not inferior to
Yes, sir, it's not inferior.
cyclophosphamide, right? So, but they didn't say that cyclophosphamide is superior to
No, not superior,
rituximab
sir.
for a particular category
Yes, sir.
on the basis of those studies. So I would not entirely agree with that. See, one way of deciding is whether you're dealing with a young individual
Yes,
or
sir.
an older individual.
Yes, sir.
In a young individual, you are worried about gonadal toxicity,
Sir,
right? Which can occur with cyclophosphamide.
cyclophosphamide.
So in a young individual, the preference would be in favor of
Rituximab.
rituximab. That's how I would decide. Okay. So my first choice would be rituximab. In an older individual, like this patient, she's 62. So here you have no worries about the gonadal toxicity. You only want a good outcome. So here you have both choices. So you could use either cyclophosphamide or rituximab in this patient. Okay. So that is currently the way I would decide about it. If you're talking of a young patient, first choice, rituximab. Older patient, either of the two drugs can be used as the first choice induction. But there is one other caveat to this, which I would add, which is very important. See, a post hoc analysis of the data of the RAVE study, which they did separating patients according to the ANCA serotype.
Yes, sir. PR3.
Right? It showed that the patients who have a PR3 positivity, 65% of those who received rituximab had a complete remission, as compared to only 48% of those who received cyclophosphamide. This
Superior
was
to
a
rituximab.
later sub-analysis that was done.
Yes, sir.
So on the basis of that, there is now a new algorithm that is being suggested beyond what I just said. One way is, of course, looking at the age of the patient is certainly important.
Yes,
right?
sir.
But what another thing that is now being suggested is look at the ANCA serotype and then decide. Okay.
Yes, sir.
I would like all those who are listening to this program to see, this is the latest publication
Core
on the
curriculum.
latest review article on ANCA-associated vasculitis. Some of you might have read it. This is in the core curriculum
AJKD.
series in AJKD. This was published only in January this year. All right. So all of you should go through it, because the point that I'm just making is emphasized clearly in an algorithm here, which is given in this article, right? So briefly, what they are saying is that you separate patients with just mild to moderate kidney failure who are not dialysis dependent from those who are dialysis dependent. Because dialysis dependent means you have more severe renal disease, all right? And in those with mild to moderate renal failure, right? If the PR3 ANCA is positive, then on the basis of the RAVE post-hoc analysis that I just mentioned, you should use rituximab as first-line therapy, right? Whereas if it is a MPO ANCA positive, then you go for cyclophosphamide and steroids. Okay, so based on the ANCA serotype in the patients with less severe kidney involvement. Whereas in those who have severe kidney involvement, you go for either rituximab and steroid in all patients, or you can even consider a combination
Combining
of
rituximab and rituximab and cyclophosphamide combined.
yes,
Rituximab trials.
combination of all three.
Yes, with low dose of steroids.
With low dose of, yeah, we'll come to the dose of steroids. So that is how they are now separating the line of therapy. So depending on the ANCA serotype, so PR3 serotype deserves rituximab consideration, whereas with MPO, you can go with either therapy. Even cyclophosphamide is as good. If you have more severe renal failure, again, consider either rituximab or a combination of rituximab and cyclophosphamide. Okay, so this is
Dr. Skuja.
yes.
But
Yes.
what PR3 in all PR3 cases, you will prefer rituximab.
Yes, you would. The preference would be for rituximab. The only issue is that if you go for rituximab versus cyclophosphamide, you'll be saving the gonads of the patient. But if you go for cyclophosphamide, yes, then you are putting that patient at risk for gonadal toxicity. So that also should be borne in mind. But PR3, yes, you would prefer rituximab.
Okay.
Right. So now as I mentioned, so another option for induction therapy, could we see Dr. Yogesh again?
Sir, I am there.
Yes. So another option for induction therapy is this triple combination that we have just talked about.
Yes,
and
sir.
there is one important paper by McAdoo et al., which was published in 2019, which has described the results of this triple therapy as compared to cyclophosphamide and steroids. And they showed that the results were significantly better in the group that received a combination of cyclophosphamide and rituximab. However, then the advantage of avoiding gonadal toxicity is lost, right? So you reserve it for those patients with the severest form of disease, with PR3 ANCA, who are not responding to just rituximab alone, you could combine. Or refractory disease, that is where you should use the triple drug combination, right?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Now, anything else that you should do during induction therapy?
Sir, various studies are coming about the role of avocapan, sir.
Avocapan or
Yes, sir.
avacopan. Okay.
Avacopan.
Right. Yes.
So,
What is it used as in this situation?
sir, to reduce the dose of steroids, sir.
Yeah. So it's not the primary induction agent.
Yes, sir.
It's only a steroid sparing agent.
Yes, sir.
Which and how does it act?
So it acts by inhibiting the complement C5 receptor, C5a receptor. It is a monoclonal antibody against and that receptor, sir.
Yeah, because complement also has a role in the pathogenesis of ANCA-associated vasculitis, even though as we said there is no hypocomplementemia. And avacopan, which is an inhibitor of C5a, has been used as a steroid sparing agent, but not as the primary induction agent.
Plasma exchange.
Yes, plasma exchange is the other mode of therapy that can be used in these patients. Now, what is the latest status as far as plasma exchange is concerned? We'll try to shorten the discussion on this because it's already 10:30.
Sir, Plexivast trial, sir, which has recently been published in the NEJM, sir. So it took around 700 some patients, 704 or 9 patients, sir, and it was basically an open label randomized control trial in which there were 2 groups. One was plasma exchange versus no plasma exchange, in which we were checking the superiority of plasma exchange versus no plasma exchange, and there was another group in which they was giving standard dose steroid versus low dose steroid, in which we were checking non-inferiority of standard dose low dose steroid over standard dose steroid. And there were also patients with pulmonary hemorrhage. The inclusion criteria was the GFR should be less than 50 ml per minute per 1 centimeter square the body surface area. So what they did find was that pulmonary hemorrhage. Yes, sir. Yes. So what they did found was that there was no advantage of, and the primary composite endpoint was a combination of death and ESRD, sir. So plasma exchange has no advantage over no plasma exchange in primary endpoints, sir. And
yes. So in other words, the conclusion was that plasma exchange did not improve the outcomes. The outcomes were equal in the 2 groups, right? So this trial has therefore cast doubt on the usefulness of plasma exchange in these patients. So currently people have reduced the use of plasma exchange in these patients considerably, but you may still consider it for patients who have very severe life-threatening disease, like life-threatening pulmonary hemorrhage, respiratory failure. You may still consider it in that situations. I would not totally rule it out, but the results of this trial tend to suggest that plasma exchange may not be useful. I would put it that way, right? And what was the other important conclusion of this trial?
Regarding
other important thing that this showed?
Sir, regarding this dose of steroid which we are using, sir.
Exactly. That low dose steroids are as good as high dose steroids. So you can start with, after the methylprednisolone, you can start with 0.5 milligram per kilogram per day, taper it off more rapidly, right? And that significantly reduces the risk of infection, much lower infection risk. So low dose steroids are better than high dose steroids. Okay, that was the other conclusion. And next we come to the, when do you switch to maintenance therapy?
So when the patient has achieved remission, which is based upon the disappearance of the hematuria and RBC cast from the urine, sir.
Yes.
An improvement or stabilization of serum creatinine.
Yes.
And
okay. So at roughly at how many months does that take?
Sir, around 5 to 6 months, sir, मतलब around 6 months, 3 to 6 months, sir.
Yeah, anywhere between 3 to 6 months, this could take usually. And so that is the time when you switch to a maintenance regimen. So how would you treat these patients for, as far as the maintenance regimen is concerned? What would you put them on?
Sir, so regarding maintenance, previously azathioprine was considered as the standard drug for maintenance, but now after main Ristan trial, sir, it has shown that rituximab is superior to azathioprine in maintenance remission, in maintenance therapy, sir. So we have option of both using rituximab or azathioprine, sir.
Yes, that's right. So the main Ritsan trial showed that the relapse rate on rituximab was only 5% as compared to 29% on
Azathioprine.
azathioprine. So a very significant difference. And what was the rituximab regimen?
So they used rituximab, 375 milligram per meter square of body surface area at 0, 14, 6, 12, and 18 months.
Yes, so 5 doses in 18 months. 5 doses of 500 milligram each in over a period of 18 months, and then they followed up these patients up to 28 months, and this was the result. So any modification of this schedule
Yes,
of
sir.
rituximab?
Sir, Menristan 2 trial, sir, it suggested that depending upon the CD19, CD20 level, sir, we can decide the dose of rituximab. So in the fixed dose arm, they received 5 infusions of rituximab, whereas in this arm, they received only 3 doses of rituximab. So
Yeah, so that's an attempt to reduce the dose of rituximab so that you have less neutropenias, less infections during the maintenance therapy. So that's an attempt to reduce the dose of rituximab. But what was the conclusion of the second study with the reduced dose of rituximab?
they are equally effective in maintaining remission, sir.
No, again, the results depend on the ANCA serotype. All right. In the patients with PR3 positivity, the fixed dose regimen of 500 milligrams, which you mentioned just a short while back, is the preferable one. In the MPO ANCA patients, the reduced dose rituximab regimen appears to be as good. All right. So rituximab is now becoming the therapy of choice, not only for induction, but also for maintenance. Of course, the cost is a factor that would differ between the two situations, but otherwise it's a good form of therapy for maintenance as well. How long? Yes, one thing that is important is how long should maintenance therapy continue?
Yes, sir. So according to the KDIGO 2012 guideline, it said that at least 18 months of therapy was required, and then there came the REMAIN trial, which compared 18 months versus 24 months versus 48 months of remission.
Yes.
Maintenance therapy, and it showed that the relapse rate were less in 48-month group, but the major relapse was only 25% in the 24 months group. So again, sir, they said that although the major relapse is only 1/3 of the patient had major relapse in the low 24 months group, but the dose required was less. So, the duration was less, sir.
Yeah, again, the PR3 ANCA positive patients are more likely to relapse. This is well known. Right?
Yes, sir.
So therefore, in them, the maintenance therapy should last longer. But nobody knows the exact limit. When would you stop? What would be the right thing to do? And there is a school of thought that even believes that maybe maintenance therapy should be lifelong. There are some people who still believe that maintenance therapy should be given lifelong. So I don't think there is a clear answer on that. But once again, go by the PR3 subtype, and those who have had diffuse disease are also more likely to relapse. right? Rather than say renal limited disease. So if they've had diffuse disease, again, so you may go on with maintenance therapy for a longer period of time. Now, when they are on rituximab maintenance therapy, what kind of infections has one got to protect them against?
Capsulated organisms, sir. Infection with
Any other?
capsulated and
Any prophylactic?
hepatitis B,
therapy?
sir. There's
For
a
hepatitis B, what would you do?
so we would vaccinate patient if possible.
Yeah. So one is prophylactic vaccination. You make sure that they are vaccinated for hepatitis B, because otherwise that can be reactivated by rituximab.
Yes, sir.
And what other vaccinations?
So we have Engerix, in which we give, which is
No,
inactivated.
not hepatitis B. I'm
Yes, sir.
talking of other vaccinations.
So
Not of
pneumococcal vaccine, sir,
pneumococcal vaccine and the third one,
inactivated influenza vaccine, sir.
influenza. So 3 vaccines: flu, pneumococcal, hepatitis B should be given, right? Anything else for chemoprophylaxis?
So we can give Septran, trimethoprim
Yes,
sulfamethoxazole.
cotrimoxazole for
Yes, sir.
pneumocystis prophylaxis
Yes,
is
sir.
required in these patients. Whether fluconazole should also be given, some people believe in giving it weekly for candida prophylaxis, but I have not been using this, right? That's one other thing. And the last point that before I open it to questions, if you have any, in patients who have anti-GBM and ANCA both positive, how would you manage them?
So we would manage is in the initial phase, we would manage it as anti-GBM disease. The difference would be that unlike anti-GBM disease, we have to prevent relapse also because there is ANCA positivity. So we have to continue remission therapy also, sir, after induction of remission.
Yeah, they are more likely to relapse than the usual anti-GBM patients. So therefore, yes, they require therapy for that. But the other thing is that you will do plasma exchange.
Plasma exchange, yes, sir. Yes, it has to be
that
done.
you should remember.
Yes.
You will do plasma exchange in them. Any new form of therapy that has been used in just a few patients with anti-GBM disease?
So IDIS, sir. IDIS.
IDs, very good,
yes,
very good. You mentioned that. That's good. So what is IDs? IDES.
IgG degrading enzyme derived from Streptococcus. Actually, it breaks immunoglobulin into Fab and Fc fragments, sir, and it breaks entire immunoglobulin. So
Yeah,
because
so-
anti-GBM is such an abrupt disease, maybe there is it may help, sir.
Yeah. So as yet, this has been tried in just very few patients, less than half a dozen patients. And so therefore, we don't really know how effective this will ultimately turn out. Anti-GBM is a rare disease, so we don't really have good experience. But this may be one new form of therapy that can be tried in patients who have anti-GBM mediated disease. And yet another form of a therapy that might be useful, again, we don't have data really on this point, is rituximab, again, in case of anti-GBM antibody mediated disease. So it may be worthwhile, but it needs to be tried out before we can talk about this. And just one final word. Have you heard of the Ritazarem trial?
Yes, sir.
Which is ongoing?
Yes, sir. Ritazarem. Now, till now, whatever maintenance we give, we had used induction as a cyclophosphamide agent. Now, in Ritazarem trial, what we are doing is that we are giving induction with rituximab, and we are comparing maintenance with rituximab versus azathioprine, sir.
Yeah, in the earlier, the main RITSAN studies, the remission was induced in all those patients with cyclophosphamide, and then rituximab given as a maintenance therapy compared with Azoran. Here, the induction also has been induced by rituximab, and the maintenance is also being done with rituximab. So this may result in a difference in the results, because here the induction also is rituximab based, right? So
yes,
the results of this trial are still awaited. This is an ongoing trial. So I think you've done a good job. You read up, but whatever little gaps are there, you can read up this latest article that I mentioned. Once again, I'd like to emphasize, go through this article, and I think I've tried to cover most aspects of the subject in the time that was available. If there are any important questions, I'll be happy to take them up. Thank you very much indeed.
You have
Thank you, sir.
really enlightened all of us.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Very nice, very nicely. You have taught everything, and now they can go through it.
Yes, please, can you unmute everybody so that if there are any questions? Please, Naveen, Deepak, you please unmute everybody.
Sir, I have one question, sir.
Yeah.
Sir,
Yes,
if a patient is having relapse and infection both at the same time, sir, so then how to approach that patient, sir? If a
That's
patient,
Yes, that's a difficult situation. The management of the infection is certainly very important, because if you don't manage the infection and give immunosuppression, then the infection itself may take away the patient. So therefore, rapid management of the infection, early management of the infection, very important before you start immunosuppression. And if you're dealing with a neutropenic patient, then always use GCSF to reverse the neutropenia quickly. And as soon as you have given a suitable antibiotic to cover the type of infection you're having, you've given the antibiotic for at least 5 to 7 days. Then after that, you can start with immunosuppression. And the immunosuppression can also be given in a sequential fashion. Don't start with the entire immunosuppression at one go.
okay, sir.
So that is what I would do. Use GCSF if there is neutropenia with serious infection, certainly.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
So there were some queries in the question and answer session. Would Balaji like to take up? I think there's three questions.
Please post it on the screen.
Yes, sir. One is to the presenting student. I think it is asked by Dr. Sunil Prakash. Will anti-GBM require maintenance therapy?
No, anti-GBM is a single hit disease, so it does not require maintenance.
Yes, you're right. If it is a pure anti-GBM antibody mediated glomerulonephritis, then the immunosuppressive therapy is required usually for 3 to 6 months. It's only until the anti-GBM antibody has disappeared. And generally, as Dr. Yogesh has just said, this is a single hit disease. Relapses are extremely, extremely rare, and therefore no further therapy is generally required beyond a maximum of 6 months. So you don't require any other maintenance therapy in such patients.
There was one more question, sir. I think in general he has asked Dr. Sunil Prakash again. In
I can't hear you.
Please louder, please.
Yes, sir. Just a minute. Can you hear me, sir?
Yes.
Yes.
The question is, in RTGN after remission, how to plan maintenance therapy? What are the current guidelines? Question number one. And number two, any difference in 4 subtypes of RTGN? Third, any newer drug on horizon with reference to advanced phase 3 trials completed? Everything is in on RTGN.
One you said was any newer drug?
Yes, sir. On horizon.
No, we already talked about Avacopan, and the only other drug, the only newer drug that I'd like to mention is there is only one study on tocilizumab, which is an IL-6 receptor antagonist, and that has shown beneficial effects in one study as an induction agent, but there are no data comparing it with rituximab or cyclophosphamide. So I would use it only I would consider using it only in patients who are refractory to all other forms of currently used therapy. And for patients who are refractory, another thing that I might try using is IV immunoglobulins. These are the only other therapies that I might consider in patients who are not responsive to other forms of therapy. What was the other question? You said any difference in treatment of the 4 types of ANCA vasculitis?
Yes, sir. 4 subtypes of RPG.
4 subtypes, yeah. No, there's no other difference. The only difference is based upon the ANCA serotype, as I've already mentioned. So if it is PR3, then treat with rituximab preferably, and treat for use rituximab for maintenance also, and give maintenance therapy for a longer period. This would be the main difference between those types. So it would depend on the ANCA serotype.
Sir, last question. Role of following ANCA titer in maintenance. This is from
Yes.
Dr. Prasad.
Yes, many years ago, it was thought, that following up the ANCA titers is useful. And it was even suggested that if there is a 4-fold rise in the ANCA titer, then you should think of increasing the intensity of immunosuppression. But now this is no longer considered valid. So monitoring ANCA titers while on maintenance therapy is not really considered worthwhile. The clinical parameters are certainly important. Clinical features of vasculitis, both renal and non-renal, and the BVAS score is important, but monitoring ANCA titers is not important.
I think now this is all summed up by comment from Dr. Surya Prakash that I have never heard a better exposition of RPGN from bedside to latest guidelines after 1993. No words to thank Professor Vinay Sakhuja. Sir, it was a real academic feast, and all of us, we have learned today. And I'm sure you also must be satisfied from presenter, Dr. Yogesh.
Yes. He has done a good job. He has done an
sir.
excellent job. Very good.
Dr. Rana,
Thank you,
sir.
sir.
Dr. Rana, sir.
Very well. As usual, very nice to. He's an excellent teacher. He knows how to teach.
I'm really grateful to Dr. Bhalla and Dr. Rana for having given me this opportunity to participate in the program.
We'll give you more opportunities.
Certainly. I'll be happy to participate again. And I'm also very grateful to Mr. Raja of Microlabs Limited for this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you and namaste.
Thank you, sir.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, all the audience. We look
Thank you.
for one more.